Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. There's been anger and outrage around the world since the killing last week of prominent Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She was shot and killed while reporting for Al Jazeera in the West Bank. She was clearly identified as a member of the press. Shireen was 51 years old. Both Israeli and Palestinian officials are arguing over who fired the bullet. With no definitive answers about who killed Shireen, this is making an already tense situation even worse.
You know, on one level, you have the fight over the investigation, but on the broader level, you see this war over the narratives. The Palestinians have already promoted this narrative that she was killed. They say Israel killed her, and they say that Israel killed her intentionally. And the Israelis are saying, there's no way to know until we analyze this thing.
Josef Federman knows what it's like to report in the West Bank. He's the news director of the Associated Press for Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Jordan. He's been working in the region for almost 2 decades. We'll talk to him about why Shireen Abu Akleh's death is creating such an uproar and what it means for the stability of the region. This is the Decibel. Joe, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So you've been working in Jerusalem for a long time now, and you knew Shireen on a professional level. What was her reputation like as a journalist?
She had a very good reputation. She's very well regarded by her colleagues, especially in Ramallah, in the West Bank, which is where she covered. The feeling since she died, you just see mass showings, outpourings of grief. Her colleagues are devastated. A good friend of mine was good friends with her, and he's still very upset. The office in Al Jazeera, here we are a week later, and people are still crying in the office. So people felt this, I think, very personally in the journalistic world, and especially among Palestinian journalists.
The death of a journalist is a shock, especially one that was clearly marked as being part of the press, part of the media. But unfortunately, journalists are killed sometimes in conflict zones. We know even in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, the last few months, at least 7 journalists have been killed there. But people are paying particular attention to Shireen's death here. Why do you think this has sparked such a response, both on the ground, but also just from the international community writ large?
Yeah, you're right. There are dozens, if not scores, of journalists who die in the line of work each year. You mentioned Ukraine. I just saw a report, I think, about Mexico, just huge numbers in Latin America. We had a staffer killed in Gaza during a war in 2014, and it is devastating. Devastating to see a colleague die, devastating to deal with their families, to break the news and try to console them. I mean, it's just awful. This case, why did it get so much attention? There are a number of reasons. I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I don't know if I have all of the answers. Part of it, I think, is the American citizenship issue. Part of it is that Al Jazeera is such a high-profile satellite channel. The fact that she was one of the best-known personalities. She covered the West Bank. She covered the Palestinian story for a quarter of a century. And if you talk to any Arab colleague that I've spoken to, you hear comparisons to Amanpour and things. She was very well known across the entire Arab world because she had done it for so long and she was so visible.
And when you say Amanpour, Christiane Amanpour from CNN, you're referencing, just to clarify there.
Everybody says that, every Arab home that watched Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is the most popular news channel in the Arab world. So everybody knew her. So you have the celebrity element, you have the American element, and then you have this conflict, which is just so heavily scrutinized by all of the different sides. So when you add all of that up together, you end up with a high-profile case like this.
Now, Shireen was reporting from a city called Jenin in the West Bank there, where she was killed last week. Why was she there?
Jenin is a town in the northern West Bank that over the years has gained a reputation as being a stronghold for Palestinian militants. It's a place where the Israeli military often operates, and over the past month, 4 to 6 weeks or so, it has stepped up those operations because there were a number of attacks that took place inside Israel, inside Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv. Many of these attacks, I think 3 or 4 of them, the attackers originated in Jenin. So in response to that, Israel's always active in Jenin, but it's become even more active in recent weeks. So Al Jazeera, was on the spot covering one of these military raids as it was unfolding. And what you see in Jenin, usually it's a very standard pattern. We wake up. Often the military usually acts overnight. We get an announcement that they went in to arrest somebody and so forth. And usually these incidents pass without, there may be gunfights. Sometimes there's some violence, but usually they pass. In this case, she happened to be there at the wrong time and she got caught in some sort of shootout. And unfortunately, she was killed.
But it sounds like this was kind of a standard assignment for Shireen then. This was kind of one of the normal things that she would do day to day. If there was some kind of conflict going on, this is the kind of thing that she would be covering.
Well, this was her beat. She covered the Palestinians, she covered the West Bank, and this is obviously, it's a huge story in the region, but it's a huge story especially for the Palestinians because they feel it. When the Israeli military comes in and raids a Palestinian town like this, people feel it and they talk about it. And she felt that it was her role to tell the world what was going on there. And this is, the top item going on for the Palestinians in the West Bank right now.
Yeah. So who is responsible for her killing is being disputed. But what can we say for sure happened that day?
It's impossible to say at this point, and I have a feeling we're never really going to know. This reminds me, there was a famous incident over 20 years ago, similar in the Gaza Strip, right at the beginning of the Second Palestinian Uprising, where a 12-year-old boy named Mohammed al-Dura was killed in a shootout between Palestinian militants and Israeli troops. And to this day, the two sides are fighting over who was responsible. And it seems like a similar pattern now is unfolding in the West Bank. The military, the Israeli army, says it was operating in a battle zone. It said that there were gunmen in the area. Its troops were under fire, and they opened fire in response to this threat. She was identified as a journalist. She had a protective vest that said press on. The people who were with her, the witnesses, including other journalists, say they only saw Israeli soldiers at the time. When they reached the area, they actually saw soldiers and waved to them and identified themselves as journalists, hoping to protect themselves. So they are saying, the people who were there and the Palestinian officials are saying nobody else could have done it. Except the Israelis. And some people are even accusing the Israelis of assassinating her and killing her intentionally. We have not found any evidence to support that. It just, right now, it's a classic case of he said, she said. Both sides can provide a little bit of evidence to support their versions. And what we see now is that, there was a battle underway over custody of the bullet that killed her. The Israelis say there's no way you can identify who fired that bullet until it's analyzed by ballistics experts, and they can even match it to the guns that were used during that operation. The Palestinians have the bullet, and they refuse to turn it over to the Israelis. They do not trust the Israelis. They say they're capable of doing their own analysis. The Palestinians have said after they do their analysis, they're willing to allow international experts, to look at their results and their findings. But in the meantime, they have their own people doing an analysis. But again, without matching the bullet to the weapon, pretty much every expert I've spoken to says it's impossible really to reach conclusive findings.
What's been the response from the international community to this?
Anytime you see a journalist killed in any conflict area, I think people get upset. There's also the added element, Shireen was an American citizen. So the U.S. has taken a special interest in this case because an American citizen has now been killed. So what you see are lots of calls for an open investigation, a thorough investigation. Nobody has really pointed the finger at one side or the other. Afterwards, there was some anger over Israel's handling of the funeral, but the actual shooting, I think there's a lot of concern, but people have been measured about assigning blame so far.
I think a lot of people may have seen a video that's been circulating online that was filmed at her funeral. In the video, pallbearers are carrying her casket. What happened at her funeral there?
That's another, as around here, it's not always easy getting to the bottom of things. What appears to have happened is that the family had a plan. The coffin was going to be taken from the hospital, loaded into a car, and driven to the cemetery. What appears to have happened is that people got very emotional. As we talked about, she was really iconic, a real hero locally, and people sort of took control of that casket and they started marching. And the police did not like that. The police claim that there were arrangements with the family to avoid a procession on foot ahead of time. The family sort of denies that. The family said it had plans and that the idea was for that coffin to be loaded into a car, but they also say they could not control the emotions of people who were there. But police decided that this was turning into a nationalistic, they even said there was incitement by the crowd, and they issued videos afterwards with police calling on the crowd, do not sing nationalistic songs, do not start chanting slogans or whatever. And the crowd got kind of worked up, and they were also waving Palestinian flags, which, the bigger issue here is the battle for Jerusalem. Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967. Israel considers the entire city to be its capital. The Palestinians want East Jerusalem to be their own capital, capital of a Palestinian state. So when Israel sees displays of nationalism like that, when people start singing the Palestinian national anthem and they start waving Palestinian flags, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of people doing that, the police decided to move in.
There are moments where there are police with batons beating people carrying the casket, causing them almost to drop Shireen's casket there too.
Exactly. So I think even on the Israeli side, in retrospect, you hear lots of people saying this was really bungled.
Let's actually turn into the investigation into who did kill Shireen. Israel has called for a joint investigation with the Palestinians. Where does that stand?
For the time being, the Palestinians are ruling out a joint investigation. They do not trust the Israelis. They think the Israelis, will find a way to whitewash the results. And the Israelis are saying you can't trust any investigation unless this bullet is analyzed and matched to the guns that were used at the time. So what you see is, on one level you have the fight over the investigation, but on the broader level you see this war over the narratives. The Palestinians have already promoted this narrative that she was killed. They say Israel killed her, and they say that Israel killed her intentionally. And the Israelis are saying there's no way to know until we analyze this thing. There is some talk because she's an American citizen. The FBI has the right to get involved, or at least to ask to be involved. The U.S. has not done that yet. And the U.S. has leverage over both sides as well. The U.S., obviously a very close ally of the U.S., gives billions in aid to Israel each year, but it also provides hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to the Palestinians. So the U.S. has leverage over both sides, and if the U.S. really wanted some sort of joint investigation or to figure out some sort of way for there to be a proper international investigation, I think the U.S. has ways to at least try that. We haven't seen that happen so far.
Why don't the Palestinian authorities want to hand the bullet over to an independent party to have that investigation happen, I guess, outside of either one side or the other?
The official reason is they say that they're capable of doing it themselves. Unfortunately, many, hundreds, thousands of Palestinians over the years have been killed by Israeli gunfire. Palestinian doctors are well acquainted with Israeli weapons. So they say, that they're capable of doing this themselves. I don't know how good they're for, it's one thing to repair a bullet wound when somebody's wounded, which is what they're quite good at. It's another thing to do a sophisticated, crime lab analysis. I don't know how good they are at that, honestly. The Israelis are very good at that, but they have an agenda too. I mean, they want to clear themselves. So I understand the mistrust on both sides. And honestly, I don't know how they're going to resolve this one.
Every once in a while, the simmering tensions in Israel and the West Bank make international news because of something that happened like this. It kind of breaks through the international news and everyone starts talking about it again. Last May was another time this happened. The world's attention was focused on the West Bank then because of some of the worst fighting in years was happening there. How would you characterize the stability of the region since last year, Joe?
Well, as you mentioned, we had this war that erupted exactly a year ago. I think it was May 11th, an 11-day war. May 10th or 11th, it broke out last year. We went through 11 days of very, very heavy rocket fire into Israel from Gaza and very heavy Israeli airstrikes on targets in Gaza. Very stressful, very deadly. Over 250 Palestinians were killed. I think it's 14 Israelis were killed. Pretty unpleasant all around. And since then, things had been fairly calm. We had maybe, 6, 8, 10 months of calm. And then, but you never know when it's going to happen again. And, about 2 months ago, just before we had a couple of holidays that coincided. We had Passover, the Jewish holiday of Passover, and we had Ramadan, the month-long Muslim holy month. And they coincided this year. And this is a time of, heightened religious observance. You have mass Muslim prayers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. In Islam, it's considered the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. But for the Palestinians, this is it's a national symbol. It's sort of all they have. They look to Jerusalem as their capital. They look at themselves as the guardians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is it's a holy site. It is the White House. It is the Eiffel Tower. And then you add the religious element on top of it all. You also have thousands of Jewish pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, and many of them pray at the Western Wall, which is right next to Al-Aqsa. The Palestinians look at that, they think that the Israelis are going to take over Al-Aqsa someday. Israel denies this. But sometimes that doesn't matter. It's all about perception. And what happens is, you start with one incident and then you start with another and things escalate. Now, right around the same time, we had the first attack. I actually think it was before Ramadan, a week or two before Ramadan, the first attack in southern Israel where 4 people were killed. I think it was a stabbing rampage and car ramming attack. And then a few days later, we had another deadly attack near Tel Aviv. And then we had another attack inside Tel Aviv. I hope I'm getting the order of everything correct. And then about a week or two ago, we had a 4th attack. So every time there's an attack, Israel responds. And the bottom line is, in the past, I would say 6 to 8 weeks, it's either 18 or 19 Israelis have been killed in various attacks, and we have over 30 Palestinians who have been killed in Israeli military raids.
Joe, you've been covering this region for almost 2 decades now. Where do you see the current tensions that have erupted in the last week, specifically over Shireen's death? Where do you see these going in the coming months?
It's impossible to say because there's so many factors. First of all, you have to see what steps do the sides take to calm things down. The new Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, he's been in power for almost a year now, but his attitude, he does not want to see Palestinian independence. He says he's not even ready for peace talks with the Palestinians, but he does believe, he calls it shrinking the conflict. He does believe in trying to ease tensions. He has taken a bunch of steps to improve the Palestinian economy, to allow more Palestinians, including from Gaza, to enter Israel, to come in and work, where the wages are much higher than in the Palestinian territories. So he may try to calm things down. It's also a test for the Americans. The American ambassador, who I met with a couple of weeks ago, they don't think conditions are ripe for peace talks, but one of his jobs is to make sure what he says is that neither side does anything stupid those are his words, not mine, to prevent things from getting worse. So what you may see is some U.S. intervention. And keep in mind, President Biden is tentatively expected to visit sometime in June. So the last thing that I think Israel wants is for Jerusalem to be on fire with daily, clashes and violence and so forth. So there are incentives for Israel to try to calm things down, but at least in the short run, if anything, it just seems like there's going to be more friction in the short term.
Yeah. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through all this.
Thank you.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our intern is Emily McPhail. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Rachel Levy-McLaughlin. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.